people die when your traveler abandons you.
Hello. My name is Aaron, but you can call me Hallowed if you'd like. Today we will be discussing Eramis' redemption arc as of Act 2 of Destiny's episode Revenant, prior to Act 3's release. In this video, I will first go over why Eramis' redemption arc is narratively important to the story of the Eliksni, and then I will be going over some of my issues that I've been having with how this character arc is being handled, as well as possible means to improve it. These will just be suggestions, however, and I'm always open to hear more people discuss their opinions on this subject in the comments below, no matter how this video is going to age. Additionally, while I'm going to be talking about this from a storytelling perspective, I do want to disclose that I am aware that the root of my complaints are directly correlated to the current state of the game and the status of the development team as a whole, rather than the writing team themselves. However, since everyone and their mother has been pointing out the various bugs and severe quality of life drops that have occurred after the mass layoffs, I don't really see a point of getting into that myself. Instead, I'll stick to what I know: storytelling. So without further ado, let's get started. Chapter 1. The narrative importance of Eramis' redemption arc. Right off the bat, I'm gonna say it. The problem with Eramis' redemption arc is not Eramis herself, or how her character is written, or even how the story of Destiny has gone so far with its trend towards giving second chances. Eramis has been treated as a sympathetic villain and set up to be redeemed since her debut in Beyond Light. This is not a new thing. The issue lies within the mechanism of the storytelling itself. If your mind instantly goes to all the bullshit that she pulled during the time that we've been fighting her, don't worry. I have a whole separate video on her misdeeds where I go over which of her transgressions are legitimately hers, and which ones are things that the witness either set her up to do, or outright forced her into doing. The general gist of it, however, is that while Eramis' anger and inability to let go of her desire for vengeance doomed her in Beyond Light, she learned what she did was wrong in Plunder. Pretty much her entire life after the witness defrosted her was just her realizing how badly she fucked up. Also, Eramis is indeed our first actual redemption arc in Destiny, so the argument that we've had too many of them falls flat. No, I do not count Crow. His whole entire arc was about how he was not Uldren, but that he was going to take responsibility for him anyways because he's just such a nice guy. Mara kinda got a redemption arc, but that was only in terms of her learning to not be abusive to Crow, so it's still not really a full arc. Nor do I count Keitel, because she never wanted to conquer humanity to begin with, nor Riven, as she was a victim of the Awoken from the get-go, and especially not Savathun, because Savathun is out there Savathooning and has zero regrets about any of it. In terms of actually redeeming a villain character, Eramis is legitimately the first. First and foremost, however, I think I need to address the writing issue currently at play here. I need to make it clear. Eramis is a nuanced, well-written character, and her actions and motivations are roughly on par with that of the Vanguard, or Mara Sov in terms of the sheer amount of shit that she's willing to do for her people. The issue, however, is that there is a sharp divide between the Eramis that we see on screen and the Eramis that we are presented in the lore, which are almost two different entities entirely. We are given almost no indication in-game as to what she is really thinking, and the lore books where we do get glimpses into her psyche after the events of Beyond Light are scattered in among other characters. We get a very good understanding of what she's thinking and how her thought process works from these lore books, but in-game, we're presented only with Eramis, Kell of Darkness, the mask that she operates behind. This is a problem. If I had to make a comparison between Eramis and one of the characters on our own side, I think the quickest and dirtiest option would be to compare her to Mara Sov. Now, Eramis is no Mara Sov, but both of them are rulers who have a lot of blood on their hands from moments where they did horrible things that they genuinely believed were for the good of their own people, moments that they now deeply regret. However, many people misunderstood Mara before she began to learn to open up because she hid her true self behind a mask, which is something that is shared between her and Eramis. However, this misunderstanding applies double when it comes to Eramis, as unlike Mara Sov, all of her internal dialogue is constrained exclusively to the lore taps. This is unspeakably important for understanding her character. The Eramis that we see on the surface is not actually the same as the Eramis that we see internally, which is the Eramis that we need to understand in order for it to become clear why she's being redeemed. Because she is capable of redemption, and her being redeemed instead of killed is deeply important to the fate of the Eliksni people for a multitude of different reasons. For clarity's sake, however, let's narrow it down to 3 points. The first being her tie to old Riis, the second being her ability to mentor Eido in many of the things that Mithrax failed to do, and the third being the fact that she represents the rest of the Eliksni who could not lay down their arms and risk everything to join the last city. I'll go over all three of these points in detail, but first I need to go over Eramis herself, because the game isn't really doing a good job at explaining her through the gameplay alone. Eramis' story is one of deep tragedy. She was a member of the House of Dancers on Riis pre-Whirlwind, and her job was to track the movement of the Great Machine through the sky, presumably for the purpose of religious ceremonies. She was mate bonded to Atheris, an artisan, and the two of them had many hatchlings, of whom Eramis was rearing to follow her footsteps, though she wished for them to be more like Atheris, makers, builders. From the sounds of it, they had an ideal life, a life that was torn from them with the coming of the Whirlwind, when the Traveler abandoned them to flee the Black Fleet. While Eramis and her family managed to get off the planet alive, they lost everything. The Drift was a hellish place. Hellish enough that Eramis herself uses it as an equivalent to hell in our language, and while Atheris and her children survived the bulk of the Drift, their current status remains unknown. Eramis sent them back to the Riisian system after they entered Sol, presumably once the first of the Dancer ships began to wage war on humankind. Atheris was a kind soul, while Eramis was stubborn and strong. No doubt Eramis did not want her to see the atrocities that she would commit against the denizens of Sol, though she acted out of righteous fury at the injustice of what they had lost. Unfortunately, Eramis herself requires the guidance of others in order to be her best self, and Atheris, in Namrask's own words, was Eramis's guiding glint. By sending her mate and her children away to another star, Eramis lost herself, and thus began her descent into damnation. An important thing to consider is that we don't know when Eramis joined the fight as a warrior. What we do know is that she became a baroness of the House of Devils and became a prolific, deadly pirate, as many of the Eliksni did post-Whirlwind. She participated in raids on human settlements with Kritis and Phylax, and she participated in both the Battle of Six Fronts and Twilight Gap. She was a ruthless, cunning, efficient warrior, and her reputation gained her as much notoriety across the Sol system as any other Eliksni pirate before she was eventually captured and brought to the Prison of Elders during the Reef Wars. Many of the old crews respected and feared her, and Taniks himself held a great degree of respect for her, enough for him to join forces with her for house salvation. You know, Taniks the Scarred, Taniks the Houseless, who famously looked down on many of the old Kells for their senseless desire to cling to old traditions rather than conquer Sol. The Taniks who refused to pledge any house oath because of it. That Taniks. I think that speaks volumes about her fighting prowess and leadership qualities to have won his respect out of all of the other Eliksni. However, this iteration of Eramis contrasts against what we know of her from Varix and Enax, who knew her before the Whirlwind. And above all else, Enax specifically mentions that Eramis was a meek child, and what she had become during the Long Drift was something that she had not expected from her. Take a listen to this excerpt from Enax's perspective. It would be years before we encountered another ketch. It bore the sigil of the House of Dancers, renowned for their skill with machines and their generosity to those in need. Their Kell agreed to send an emissary to discuss our needs. I knew this emissary, Eramis, when we were children. All I knew of her in adulthood was that she had a wife and hatchlings. I had hoped that the Whirlwind had taken it all from her. I hated myself for wanting that. Eramis was no longer the meek child I once knew, that much was certain when I greeted her aboard my ketch. She brought 2 hatchlings with her, just barely old enough to walk on their own. They were mischievous little things, the round one constantly trying to tug the taller one's arms off until Eramis disciplined them. I carried my son swaddled to my chest as a show of trust. Negotiations between us were tense. I quickly realized that the House of Dancers had no interest in sharing their resources, but rather in assessing our own vulnerabilities. When it was clear to Eramis that we could not be easily disabled and stripped of our ether, we found a compromise. The House of Dancers would be supplied with materials for repairs, and, in turn, we would take on some of their people, along with a fractional store of ether. She was sending them to die with us, rather than condemn them to the cold and uncaring depths of space where her people could see. I learned who Eramis had become and what ideals she lived by. 2 hands in greeting, 2 hands concealed. It was an inequitable deal, and Eramis knew it. "Your alternative is death," she offered me. A coward's voice slipped out of my mouth when I declined that choice. I asked her where her wife was, hoping I would inspire her to feel, for a moment, as hopeless as I did. She did not so much as flinch, then foisted the 2 hatchlings onto me. They were not hers, as I had assumed, but the first of the house of dancers that we would take in the exchange. Too many hands and not enough ether to go around. The simplest solution was also the most difficult one. We had to find a way to thin our numbers again. This gives us an idea of who Eramis was before her fall, and indeed just how far the House of Dancers had fallen during the drift. Eramis was allegedly a quiet and gentle child who then grew up to be a nurturing, caring mother, part of a house known for its kindness and generosity. Over the drift, she turned into someone who was calculating, cold, and brutally efficient. She would not jettison members of her house off into the depths of space, no, but she was still sending them off to death regardless. Of course, we know that some of these individuals would survive, as the 2 hatchlings given to the Weavers here were Raxus and Civix, aka the Spider and his brother, but many likely did not. Eramis still gave her people a chance, but at this point during the drift, there was no room for second chances. We do not know how or when she turned from an ambassador to a warrior, but we do know how it happened for Enax. If I had to guess, Eramis' story would not be so different. Listen again to the tale Enax gives us from the Whispering Dark. Once we found the great machine, we learned it had uplifted a whole new species, granted them power beyond anything it had ever bestowed to us. That betrayal drove some in our house to despair, others to death, and many to violence. Adapting to this betrayal was to be our next challenge. I listened to this poison-minded advice of soft-shelled cowards, and tried to speak with the great machine's new chosen, our usurpers. They repaid the machine's kindness with violence, killed 3 of my closest friends. I later discovered that they shucked their carapaces and wore their chitin as armor. We learned all we could about these usurpers, like how their limbs were supple and could be pulled from their bodies far easier than our own kind. I came to love the sound of their screams. If violence was the only language they spoke, then so be it. Time had made me fluent. Some of my house refused to abandon the old ways. The fools draped themselves in the naive raiment of splicers, praying to a god that doomed us all. They could contemplate their failure with what was left of their lives in the cold dark. I had no time for them, save for goading them into raids. If we wanted to retake the great machine, we would not do it by prostrating ourselves like weeping children. We would take it back by force. We killed the machine's chosen, taking what we could, rooting through the rotten innards of their dying world. We took refuge in the shadows of their dusty moon when the usurpers' ruins stuck out like bones from the dust. It was empty, it was silent, but there was value to be had in picking these old bones clean. This gives us a good, strong perspective of how the Eliksni felt when they found the Traveler. This was also lets us know that Eramis was not alone in her hatred for it, nor was her willingness to harness the power of their enemies for their own survival. The Eliksni who survived the whirlwind, after all, were not acting solely out of vengeance. They were acting out of the desperation of base survival. Now that is something that is deeply important to understand about Eramis' character. The fact that, up until very recently, all of her decisions were made from the perspective of someone working almost exclusively in survival mode. If they seemed irrational, then that's because they were. Even when constructing House Salvation, she wasn't thinking of anything past securing someplace to be safe, barely tipping into the second tier of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. The Eliksni we're looking at prior to the Witness entering the Traveler is someone who has been stuck in fight or flight mode for God knows how many centuries, always reaching for ways to bring herself and her people out of it, and always falling just short of reaching that goal. A perspective that makes some of her seemingly more irrational choices, like embracing the darkness to destroy the Traveler, make more sense. Remember that when we talk about the Respawn, we are talking about people who have gone from what is essentially paradise to eating the corpses of their own dead, including their own hatchlings, if what Namrask implies in Achilles weaves a cocoon is what I think it is, to needing to fight and scavenge every day for basal survival. Those are not conditions that foster rational thought. Doubly so when you see your children struggling and dying to survive in a system determined to destroy them, and know exactly what was taken from them. Eramis has essentially been a starving lioness trapped in a corner since she lost her homeworld. She strikes with the fury and desperation of a wild animal who has watched her cubs get torn from her. In this instance, we're talking about the Eliksni as her cubs. And she is now fighting tooth and nail against everything and everyone because of it. That righteous anger is what blinded her to her own mistakes, that function as the proverbial wings that flew her too close to the sun. It's only now that she's been broken by the witness that she's able to listen, and that is because she's just given up. Not on the Eliksni, no, but on herself.
Have you seen the effects of ether starvation? The way our carapace flakes, the way it peels away to expose raw muscle. It is a living death. Agony in unsleeping rot.
I've seen it. In the Eliksni who refused to kneel to House Salvation and fled across Sol for their lives. You willingly marched your own kind to their deaths in service of a lie. That's why you're here. It's what you have the power to prevent. We've both made mistakes we can't take back. I killed Cade. I created Fikrul. But I can make it better. I can own those choices and do better by the people I hurt. You can too. Help us find the defectors of House Salvation. They can integrate into the House of Light. They have a chance for a fresh start. Right here, right now.
There is no future for me. But that does not mean there must be no future for my people. I will not rob them of that. I will tell you.
By the way, as a quick side note, I don't believe that Eramis is hypocritical as much as she is very good at loudly stating things that she wholeheartedly believes to be truths, which we know to be false because we're awarded a different perspective than hers. And I say this because in the few instances where we do see strong pushback against her ideas, such as the witness and Crow's rebuttal, she tends to go very quiet before agreeing that she's wrong. This shows that she is capable of change, even if she's too proud to fully admit the error of her ways and doesn't believe that there is much of a choice regardless. And it also means that she's not entirely a hypocrite. Remember that you always have to work with what the characters know, not with what you think they should know. So what makes her redeemable? Well, it's that. It's the fact that all of her actions, even the worst of them, were born from desperation instead of hatred and a concept of ideological purity. She, and indeed the rest of the Eliksni, were just like us, struggling to find a way to survive in a universe that had tried its damn best to kill us. Arguably, the Eliksni had it much worse in that they do not have any home to go back to, and the brutality of their society post-Whirlwind was shaped by that. So is Eramis. Her position is something that thousands of other Eliksni were forced into just for survival. Hell, even her actions under the Witness were all just for basal survival, as it forced her into servitude under the threat of death, and made the whole ordeal a living hell for her. Eramis was no disciple. She was no different from any of us, really. The only thing that made her different was that she was on the wrong side of the war. And I really believe that it was her stint under the Witness that snapped her out of her little bubble to realize just how deep of a grave she dug her house into, as it was plunder when she regretted the actions that she took during Beyond Light. I've already covered some of this in my other video when I go over why she's not a disciple, but it's worth looking at it again. Here's her perspective from Between Stolen Stars, from the entry Heraldways. The console went dark. The message had ended. Eramis knew there would not be another. Come home, Eramis. Eramis closed her eyes. The words settled into the Kel's thoughts. They were heavy, sharp. She felt herself bleed with them. She had begged for death in the moment that Mizrax's blades were at her throat, and his mercy was a deeper wound than any. It was reopened now by the kindness of a child. Eramis remembered her home. Her home was Riis, devastated by the Great Machine. Her home was Athras, her mate, sleeping in a ship long since departed from this system. Her home was her hatchlings, at her mate's side. Eramis remembered watching them grow and molt, how they had chittered their delight and looked to her with their wide, luminous eyes. She would give her house to see those eyes again, but the brightness she had seen in Eido's eyes were a wide, blinding terror, not only of the Hive, of her. Come home, Eramis. Eramis lived. She lived, and she knew what the Eliksni had lost. The dream of a new Riis was delicate and beautiful. Eramis had held it in her hands, close to her chest, for so long. She knew now that she had smothered it. In all her violence and all the death that followed her, she had curled her hands into fists. The dream of a new Riis would have died with Eido if she had been left to the hive in their putrid light. But Eido did not know Riis, and neither did her father. They could look beyond that loss. Come home, Eramis. Eramis knew that she would never see anything but terror in another's eyes. Eramis knew that the Eliksni would find a new home with Eido. Eramis knew that there was no place for her in it. The first step to being a better person is to realize the wrongs you did to others. Eramis has already taken that first step, though she does not realize it. The reason why we haven't seen anything come of it, however, is because she doesn't think that she deserves a second chance. And that's an important distinction from not wanting to be better. Because the truth of the matter is that Eramis still wants her people to be saved, but she doesn't seem to realize that when we, as House Light, want to save the Eliksni, that means all of the Eliksni, including the wrongdoers like her, who have the capacity to do better, but do not have the means to dig themselves out of the pits that they've buried themselves in. Sure, there's that old phrase that you cannot help someone if they do not want to be helped, but if you're passively suicidal like Eramis, you don't have the strength to continue onwards. If someone is walking through a very long, dark tunnel and can no longer see far enough ahead of them to continue, you don't yell at them to turn back, or to keep chugging forth blindly into the dark. You give them a light. We are guardians of the light. We wield the darkness, yes, but what makes us different from the Witness is that the Witness was the antithesis of change. It wanted stagnation, and because Eramis was under its grasp up until very recently, she never had the chance to do anything but stagnate. Therefore, it makes sense for us to give Eramis a second chance, and it makes even more sense for Eido, a scribe of the light, to be the one to motivate Eramis to actually do something about that second chance. Varix couldn't help Eramis because he has fallen just as far as she has. Mithrax couldn't help Eramis because he used to be a pirate just like her, and we've already established the fact that she only reconciled what she did with the idea that it would help the Eliksni. We can't help Eramis because we're a member of the species that has been vying for her kind's extinction up until extremely recently, and we remind her of how the Eliksni used to be chosen on Riis, and we killed all of her friends. But Eido can, and that's why Eido's relationship with her is so important to her redemption arc, if we ever get enough of it for the character progression to land.
I once hoped to claim the power of the War Mind and its creations. I believed with power, I could free the Eliksni from errant suffering. But each time I grasp at what is necessary to break our shackles, I am punished. There is no hope without suffering, Guardian. So long as the great machine requires your hope, it will impart whatever suffering is needed to sustain it. In this, we are the same.
Okay, so we've established who Eramis actually is, and the fact that she's not unsalvageable. Now let's go into why we need her around in more detail. Number 1. She's a relic of old Riis. Eido's already gone over this several times in her dialogue already, but the main reason why Eramis is so essential to our mission in Revenant is because she's one of the very few Eliksni left who remember home Riis, and we desperately need that knowledge in our quest to save Mithrax. Sure, there's Varix, but Varix is old. He's also only one guy. Technically speaking, there's Namrask, but Eido hates Namrask, and the guy wants to keep a low profile, so working with him is out of the picture. Eramis is one of the few Eliksni left who survived the Whirlwind, the Drift, and us, which makes her preservation unspeakably important. Because Eramis contains the history and knowledge of not only a bygone era, but of a now extinct world. That sort of knowledge is unbelievably precious. Additionally, she has ties to other bitter old Respawn like the Apothecary, so even if she has gaps in her knowledge, she still has the means for us to bridge them. And if the Echo is to be used to restore Riis, as I believe it might be, then it's likely to need to draw off of someone who remembered how Riis was in order for the darkness aspect of its powers to work properly. While I personally don't believe that Eramis is the Kell of Kells, and I don't recall Eramis ever attempting to claim the title either, her knowledge of what is contained within the Echo may be of use beyond simply identifying the Eliksni residing inside of it. She may hold the key to Riis's recovery in her grasp. Number 2. Eramis is essential to Eido's mentorship. This point has several layers to it, and I will endeavor to cover all of them. Chief among them is the most obvious, however, and it's that Mithrax is not doing so well. And Eramis is one of the few lore-relevant older Eliksni that are available to keep an eye on Eido in the event of his death. Varix is there, sure, but Varix always has ulterior motives at play. Namrask has his own problems on top of Eido disliking him, and the Spider is the Spider. While she's been doing quite well on her own so far, the fact of the matter is that Eido is still very young, and she still needs a mentor figure to look after her. Yes, she represents the future of the Eliksni, and yes, she's a brilliant young scribe, but from the way she acts and the way that people talk about her, she still sounds like she's the equivalent of a teenager. I'd personally place her around 16 or 17 myself. She's old enough that she needs to start striking out on her own, and she's old enough that she's intellectually capable of it, but she's also certainly not old enough for her reasoning and logic centers to be fully developed. Obviously, human developmental stages cannot be applied to Eliksni, but that's what I see in her at least. In any case, she's a teenager who's watching her only parental figure slowly wither away in front of her while she's helpless to stop it, and nobody around her has a cure. She needs someone who has experience with handling grief-stricken teenagers to help her through this. And the only person among her kind with this experience is Eramis. It kind of falls on her by default, and while she is very strict on her, I also think that's something that Eido needs. Because Eido, as I said previously, is still very young and very naive. Mithrax did an excellent job raising her, but he shielded her from the horrifying reality of the Eliksni's predicament a little too well. I won't say that he coddled her, because this was done out of love, and a desire to keep her from making the same mistakes that he did in the past, but that sort of shielding can only go so far. Now that Eido has grown old enough, her naivety is only going to bite her in the ass. She needs to learn about the real world, what drove the Eliksni to such extremes, why they struggle to recuperate from that, and the fact that her actions have far-reaching consequences. That's where Eramis steps in. She's old, she's bitter, she has a wealth of knowledge to her name, and she doesn't treat Eido like she's too fragile to handle any of it.
Your focus is broken. You're distracted. Your work suffers for it. I'm not. No, you're right. I am. I'm sorry. It will not be me you are apologizing to when your father succumbs to the curse. It will not be him either, for his mind will no longer be his own. Your pleas for forgiveness will fall only to you, and you will find yourself unable to forgive, unable to forget. I know. If I fail to cure Father, it will be the end of our people. Mithrax holds the House of Light together. You will not just lose your father, you will destroy our way of life. This isn't helping. Nor is your doubting or your indecision. You are Eido, daughter of Mithrax. You bear the namesake of one of the strongest awoken heroes ever known. Earn it. I already have. Just because I have a moment of doubt doesn't make me weak. I didn't ask for your blade wisdom either. I'm not giving up.
Her speech to her in the second major fieldwork for Act 2, while harsh, is also exactly the sort of wake-up call that Eido needs to hear. She details the consequences of her actions, why failure is unacceptable, and what that failure is going to feel like when it happens. She speaks from experience, and thus gives Eido a window into potential future consequences without her having to go through them herself. It's harsh, yes, but she's not being cruel. And it works because Eido, like Eramis, is the type to snap back under pressure rather than cracking. By the way, did anyone else notice that Mizrax's treatment of Eido parallels the Traveler's logic of fresh beginnings from forgetfulness, while Eramis's lectures mirror the sword teachings of old memory from the deep? Because I did. Good job, Bungie. That's the sort of mentorship that Eido needs right now. She needs someone who is experienced in dealing with teenagers as well as well-versed in the grief of losing family members. Eramis has both of those qualities. And while her grief has famously been her downfall, she's also reaped what she's sown, and it's not likely to let Eido fall into those same traps. Additionally, let it not be forgotten that while Eramis is not the Kell of Kells, she's the closest Eliksni have come to actually unifying all the houses under a single banner. She failed when she displayed her vengeance plot against the Traveler, of course, but before the House Light rose to prominence, she still managed to successfully scrape a good lot of the Eliksni left in the Sol system into House Salvation. That displays some very sound leadership qualities that will be necessary if Eido has to momentarily step into the role of Kells, if her father dies. And Mizrax is very likely going to die. No spoilers, by the way. If there's leaks, I don't want to hear them. Please wait until a few weeks after Act 3's release to comment about them below. I also think that it's interesting how the narrative team has set up a clear contrast between Fickrell's attempts to save the Eliksni compared to the combined efforts of House Light and House Salvation. Fickrell's childish mannerisms and ideology clash against both Mizrax and Eramis, who, despite being the Kell of Light and the Kell of Darkness, are both parents guiding the new age of the Eliksni, represented here by Eido, into being. The theme of the past few years of Destiny's story is to learn that the darkness and the light need to coexist in order to have a balanced universe. We've had our own arc in unifying those powers, coalescing into our control over Prismatic. Eido, much like the Guardian, needs to learn from both the light and the dark if she wishes to save her people, and Eramis is that individual guiding her in the matters of the past. Which leads us to our third and last point. Eramis is a representative of the Elder Eliksni. I've already gone over this a bit before, but Eramis herself is not an exceptionally hateful member of the survived Riis squad. She's just the one who has gotten into the most amount of trouble so far. Even if we did dead-end her story arc by killing her, that wouldn't mean as much in the long run because as long as all the other older Eliksni survive, there will always be another Eramis. And sure, we've made leaps and bounds in fixing relations between our people, but our alliance with the House of Light is still very new, and it initially relied entirely on those Eliksni who are willing to be the bigger person, lay down their arms, and forgive humans for what they've done. We can't keep going on like that. If we want this alliance to work, then we need to do some heavy lifting in return. Because yes, while it's very likely that Namrask was the first to fire upon human civilians, and thus made the Eliksni the first aggressors in the war, the scattered nature of the houses and the catches means that it's just as likely that humankind was the ones that started the wars with the rest of the houses, as what happened with Enax's friends when they tried to make peace with human settlements. We didn't fight a war against just the House of Devils, we fought with all of them. And it was us who continued to fight that war even after we'd already won it. After all, it was us who brought the violence to House Salvation, and it was us who ran around blowing up ether tanks after we'd already killed their leaders, which is just as much of a war crime as all the other shit the Eliksni did to us. Now don't get me wrong here, I'm not saying that the Vanguard shouldn't have broken House Salvation. Eramis absolutely was leading everyone to ruin, it was very clear that she needed to be stopped, and the Space Geneva Conventions don't seem to be a thing even though the term war criminal gets thrown around a lot, both in lore and out of lore. But those non-combatants who are unaware of the full dangers of the darkness, the ones unable to forgive the Great Machine, it doesn't appear that way. From their perspective, they'd finally found a stable house with a wealth of resources and the means to defend it, and then we went in and destroyed it all. Eramis knows she fucked up greatly, but the average layperson doesn't. Not to mention the fact that the House of Light was, at the time, a small, unstable settlement entirely dependent on human mercy, and is devoted to the Great Machine. If you're not willing to risk your family by immigrating to the last city, or you bear old wounds left by the whirlwind that are too deep to stomach the sight of the Traveler, or both, then the House of Light is not an option for you. We need to make peace with these Eliksni too. Having only those Eliksni willing to risk their lives by joining humanity because they're the quote-unquote good members of their species is insufficient and shallow. They shouldn't have to bow and scrape and kiss our asses in order to be deemed worthy of being saved from extinction. By redeeming Eramis, we show that the entirety of the species is capable of redemption, and thus that all those other bitter old warriors are capable and worthy of second chances. These are all very high stakes for the Eliksni as a whole. So now that we've gone over why Eramis' redemption arc is narratively important in exhaustive detail, let's go into why I've been unimpressed with her redemption arc thus far. Chapter 2. The Problems. Now herein lies the issue with the redemption arc that we've gotten thus far. We are not getting nearly enough of Eramis' internal dialogue to understand what she's actually thinking, or if her stint with humanity has changed her mind at all. We get flashes, yes, but 2 fieldwork dialogues and a bugged Onslaught voice line that I have personally never gotten in all of my playthrough time is not at all sufficient to show how her character is developing. She's technically been involved in the story since the beginning, but her actual participation is at a minimum, despite it being clear that we have the ability to connect comms with her. Act 1 felt like it had a good chunk of dialogue to it, especially with her prison monologues, but Act 2 feels really sparse. I'm sure that this is because Varys got some time to shine with the Prison of Elders thing, but as amusing as the Warden is, I don't think it really contributes much to progressing the storyline. Likewise, the difficulty here is that Eido is the only character that Eramis actually wants to talk to, with some honesty, as everyone else was either her enemy or is perceived to be her enemy. Eido, however, she's soft on. Yes, we get some offhanded mentions that she and Eido are talking from the girl herself, but we don't actually see how any of those are going, and the few where we do has someone else on the line. Someone like Varys, or the young wolf. Characters that Eramis does not want to seem vulnerable in front of. And this makes the whole deal of working with her far more awkward, especially the prison breakout. Sure, we as a player have access to the information that Eramis doesn't have the stomach for more violence, and sure, the Guardian has had some neutral encounters with her in the past, but that information was either not made clear to the player, or was locked behind both dungeon and seasonal content. We're just told that she needs to get out in order to help lure the Echo away and heal Mizrax, and while those are both very valid reasons to release her, it doesn't feel like there was enough lead up to her breakout. Now, I definitely think that the Revenant getting moved off of the weekly update progression is the cause of this, as the weeks between each update would have been sufficient for building that sense of urgency, especially if you're playing seasonal content in between and hearing Mizrax steadily get worse. The story simply wasn't built for an all-in-one release model. But even then, I feel like there should have been more steps in between Eido realizing that we need to free Eramis, and us agreeing. Or, rather, her revelation that we need to free her should have been the closure of Act 2, and the whole prison breakout sequence should have occurred during Act 3, with Eido rushing to find something to bribe the spider with, and Eramis getting a new batch of dialogue if you visit her cell. It would have given some more leeway for us to think on why we need to move to more drastic measures, and if Eramis herself was involved, it would have been both amusing to hear her scolding us for such an idea, and an affirmation that she's not planning to start shit. As for dealing with the whole Eramis doesn't want to speak about vulnerability to anyone but Eido issue, here's what I think. I think that we need far more in-game interaction between Eramis and Eido in order for us to understand what Eido sees in her, and I think that there need to be more interactions where nobody else is present. For example, a way that we could have been presented with this is a situation where Eido is absent, and the Guardian needs to look in her datapad for tonic recipes. We know that Eido is amusingly lax in her security despite having a splicer for a father, so I doubt that Ghost would be unable to hack into her systems. There we can listen to audio logs of Eramis and Eido talking, where we can hear Eramis speaking about how she doesn't have a place in the city because her sins are too great, and she doesn't think she's worthy of anything better. Stuff that makes it apparent that she regrets her past actions and knew what she did was wrong. Let them have arguments about what Eramis being in the city means for the Eliksni who had to flee House Salvation. Have Eramis explain to Eido why she doesn't think that she can ever make a home here, and perhaps have them reach some form of compromise. I'm of the opinion that the best ending for Eramis and the other old, battle-weary Eliksni would be to be able to return to Riis with the Echo to terraform it. Maybe have them talk about what Eramis trying to return might mean, and whether or not it's possible without paracausal intervention. A future where House Salvation can reclaim Riis and maintain good relations with House Light might be ideal, but they have to work through Eido's overenthusiasm and Eramis's hopelessness first. Additionally, this would be nice for going over how House Light's actually doing in the city, and when Eramis shifted to viewing Mizrax as the last remaining hope for the Eliksni, because that's something that I missed myself, and hasn't particularly been made clear in the current storyline. I suppose that it would make sense since he's currently the Kel of the House of Light and Eido needs him around if she's to move them all to a better future, but still, further clarification would have been appreciated. Eramis also needs to have more positive interactions with the people of the last city and the Vanguard itself, in order for her to ever change her opinions on us. We've gotten some progress done with Crow, as he's probably our best bet for working with her given the fact that he's the Eliksni guy, but I also would love to see some lore tabs where she and Zavala talk, or her and Osiris have a debate. Zavala faced similar manipulation at the hand of the Witness, after all, so he has first-hand experience on what it might have done to her. He has also lost family, and knows how that grief can shape one's decisions. As for Osiris, both of them are suspicious, grumpy old farts who have had to face the city's legal system, so they'd be well suited to bicker with each other, even if they might just piss each other off in the process. Personally, I thought that was what was going to happen with that whole legal trial thing, and I'm honestly kind of sad that they seem to have dropped that story arc. Not only was it amusing to hear Eramis ranting about how the therapists were trying to psychologically torture her, it also gave us a good insight into how she thought humanity functioned, or rather, how her previous experiences with humanity shaped how she thought we would treat her. And yeah, if her words are anything to go by, then it's no surprise that she rejected reconciliation until she was literally forced to work with us. Crow gave her shit for that, but if she legitimately thought that we were going to hang her corpse from the walls of the city for her crimes, then she really wouldn't have had any incentive to reach out to us to begin with. I mean, she doesn't believe that she deserves a second chance. Why would she bother to mend burnt bridges with people that she wholeheartedly believes want to see her species either subservient to them or extinct? She might not care about her own life, but she does very much care about her people, and she can't help them if they're dead. Trust is a two-way street. It's up for us to convince her that we see the Eliksni as equals, worthy of our help, just as much as it's up for her to not betray our tentative alliance. Remember that her mistrust of us is not a distinctly Eramis thing. On the Shadestalker Helm lore tab, it's Eramis who speaks to the apothecary of our worth, even though it's Eramis who hisses to us about our past misdeeds. She's by far the more lenient and open-minded of the suspicious older Eliksni, which is saying something. Here's a transcription of the Shadestalker Helm lore tab. Ulan Tan was right. Salvation Annals, Servitor Nerix Perception Feed Dump. Filtering High Speak. Eramis, the call for aid is sent. This conversation is over. IX, you owe me answers. Eramis, you owe allegiance to your Kel. Prepare your nest for evacuation. IX, they will kill you, or worse. Eramis, a cost I will gladly pay. Our people will not survive the scorn on their own. IX, but in what state will we survive? Eramis, anything is better than annihilation. IX, you may feel differently in a human cage. Eramis, leave. I have weapons to prepare. Where scorn go, he often follows. IX, as ever, I walk my own path. If I don't see you again, I will know another piece of old Riis is lost. A snap hiss. Metal groans and shakes. IX, you can't lead from a cage. You can't inspire from the grave. Eramis, I do what I can with what I have. This lore tab offers some valuable insight into how Eramis interacts with the older Eliksni and how her experiences with the Guardians has shaped what she thinks of us. Clearly, she doesn't exactly want to work with humanity, but Eramis is a byproduct of someone who has had to fight for her survival for centuries. If there's a resource that she can exploit in order to continue the survival of her own people, she's going to use it. And that involves throwing her fate into our hands. We can't really betray that faith. For the good of the Eliksni, we need to repay it. I also want to see her experiencing frustrated pushback for her ideas, much like what happened between her and Crow when he spoke to her about seeing House Salvation refugees starved of ether. She used to do raids on human settlements so that her house would not starve. If someone else pushes back about the pain that they experienced from those raids that's just as fierce as her own grief, or draws parallels between the suffering of Eliksni and the suffering of humanity, and how sick of fighting the both of them are, that might help to change her perspective. Especially if she can also see humans and Eliksni working side by side as true allies, not whatever idea of House Light that she might have conjured in her mind. This doesn't necessarily have to be in dialogue alone. A singular lore tab would do wonders. Personally, I'm hoping that the intermediary period between her being freed in Act 2 and her getting set up for Act 3 might serve as the wake-up period for her, because I believe that Eido said that she was setting her up in the city, but I'm not going to hold my breath. Either way, however, I do think that Eramis needs to be a more active participant in order for her redemption arc to land. A forced change in perspective is one thing, actually acting on it is another. I will always stand by the idea that it's not a person's words that define them, but their actions, and that is something that I feel we really need to see in order for Eramis' redemption arc to hit its mark. Maybe this is all just empty complaining and a chunk of these issues will get addressed in Act 3, but I'm not sure. I'm also aware that it might stretch the bounds of the budget required for seasonal content, though Peter Parsons certainly can spare the cash, as we all know, but that's not really what I'm trying to suggest here. What I'm suggesting is merely some things that I believe would do a world of good in not having this character arc fall flat, given how important it is for the story of the Eliksni. For now, let's end with Eido's perspective, the ending of Salvation from Between Stolen Stars, and the ending sequence of the Faithkeeper lore tab. Eramis said that she could not turn away from her violence or her vengeance. Eido did not believe that. She could not believe it. This violence was not the Kel's spirit. Eido had to find the part of Eramis that did not rage at the past. Eido had to show the Kel of Darkness a future. Eido, you might not see the good in people, but I do, and I will never give that up. I don't want to live in a world where no one can change and nothing can get better. Eramis needs to know that, and I won't stop trying to tell her. Thank you so much for watching. Please leave your comments with your own ideas and feedback down below, and I'll see you in another video.